Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Institute for Government. The first thing to say is some of you will have had an invite with Bronwyn Maddox. Our director is chair. I'm obviously not Bronwyn. I'm Julian McRae. I'm deputy director at the Institute. Bronwyn has unfortunately hurt her ankle, broken her ankle, which causes quite a bit of pain at this time of day. So I am standing in, hopefully. Though the main event this evening is Sir Martin Donnelly, who has joined us, I think, a few weeks after formally leaving DIT, but after a very long career in Whitehall as the permanent secretary, with his reflections on the founding of that department, but I think actually you draw on some other times when you've been in departments, which have been part of mergers and the consequences thereof and creations, but also talking a bit about your views on civil service reform, where we go now. Of course, we all know the country is facing a very challenging period. We have an election coming up, we've got Brexit, we've got the pressures on public services, the role the civil service will play, and how Whitehall will be able to help the government steer a country through those challenging times will be essential. And I think everybody who's interested in these things and been following will be interested in your views on what we should do and how we should go forward. So I'll hand over to Martin to take us through his thoughts.
Well, thank you, Julian. Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here at the IFG with various friends and colleagues. And like you, I'm looking forward to our discussion. I do want to just kick off by giving a personal perspective on how we built the new Department for International Trade. After a 45-year break in national trade policy, a period beyond the memory of any civil service career in Whitehall, and then to offer some practical suggestions about priorities for further civil service reform over the coming years, drawing on my experience as a senior civil servant across 6 or so central government departments in recent decades, and very much as personal contributions to this important wider debate. And I just emphasise also that my comments are in the context of a lot of very good progress having been made. The question is, where do we want to go now? So the genesis of a new UK trade policy department, I think, can be pretty clearly dated to around 2 o'clock in the morning on Friday the 24th of June last year. In my case, just after the Sunderland result, I think. It became clear that we were going to need a radical reshaping of our small trade directorate within the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, which had until then naturally focused on influencing EU positions rather than on bilateral negotiations. So over the next days and weeks, we built on our excellent existing team to set out a structure expanded to about 6 directorates covering all aspects of a national trade policy, able to engage with business on their priorities. Specifically, with the support of our ministers, I wrote round Whitehall setting out our organisational plans and asking for recruits. We began filling the senior jobs with people with some negotiation experience from the Foreign Office and domestic departments. Setting up that team relied heavily on the Whitehall culture of collective support. Our new trade policy lead, for example, John Alty, joined the team in a matter of days from a chief executive role within the Biz family. He'd worked on trade and investment issues, had private office and board level experience, and was able to move seamlessly into that post. Other departments let key managers join our expanding team before their own jobs were filled, taking the vacancies. So when we discovered in mid-July that there was to be an entirely new Department of Trade, we weren't starting from zero on trade policy. But building capability, as you know, is not the same as delivering a separate ministry. That requires a budget, its own IT, human resources, buildings and other infrastructure, and a shared sense of identity, what we are there to deliver. Wednesday the 13th of July was our big day, our formal launch, and I remember it very clearly because I'd spent a warm afternoon giving evidence to the Public Accounts Committee in the House of Commons. And then I went over in the evening to 10 Downing Street with a private secretary and a press secretary to greet our new Secretary of State, Dr. Liam Fox. As we waited outside the cabinet room that evening, I hoped that my new boss would not ask to go straight to his office, as there wasn't one to go to at that stage. Fortunately, he was good-humoured about the small team he was leading, but it was clear we had a lot of work to do rapidly. And our first meeting took place the next morning in Dr. Fox's parliamentary office, with our new Trade Policy Director freshly arrived from Newport. The new DIT was made up of staff from the former UK Trade and Investment, plus the UK Export Finance Group, and of course our trade policy skeletal team. We had 3 junior ministers who needed officers and support. Meanwhile, the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills was morphing into Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy through a merger with the Department for Energy and Climate Change, while universities, further education and apprenticeship teams shifted to the Department for Education. I hope you're following this. Existing private officers, press office and parliamentary support showed how flexible they could be and kept the various policy shows on the road. The next 6 weeks were a bit of a blur. Alex Chisholm and I worked jointly to merge BIS and DEC and manage that change till the start of September, when Alex took over fully at BEIS and I moved full-time to leading DIT. The organisational plumbing came together thanks to a huge amount of cooperation. I was aware that any one of a series of issues separating the IT, finance, HR systems, dividing press office resources, the Treasury's natural desire to avoid spending any extra money on the changes, and issues about shared buildings could have derailed the process. Instead, Alex and his team worked seamlessly with us on separating structures. Simon MacDonald and the FCO were welcoming to DIT ministers and their support teams, who were set up within the King Charles Street building by early September. Treasury officials and the NAO accepted some shared accounting for the first months, and, perhaps reluctantly, that setting up a new department could not be cost neutral. A large number of colleagues worked on projects over the summer so we could hit the ground running when Parliament returned in September. And ministers were supportive throughout the inevitable teething process of new systems bedding down. In September, the Secretary of State's keynote speech in Manchester set out the policy direction of the new department and specifically our commitment to free trade. We knew what we were there to do. He also ensured that our first departmental board took place that month, strengthening the cohesive leadership of the department as we recruited some excellent non-executive directors. And our next job as officials was to pull together the disparate parts of the department. I worked closely with John Alty on policy, Louis Taylor, the experienced head of UK Export Finance, and Catherine Rains, the former chief executive of UKTI, as the core leadership team to provide stability and reassurance to staff, while we developed our infrastructure, delivered practical support for UK business, and managed the expansion of our trade policy teams from under 50 people in July to more than 200 by the end of the calendar year. Shared culture needs time to grow. When I arrived in BIS 18 months after a departmental merger in 2010, I remember staff from the 2 former organisations still wore different coloured security passes, and it took several years to forge a genuinely united department. In DIT, we were helped by that clear sense of purpose, but we had to recognise that the trade promotion teams had been through a series of organisational changes which had inevitably sapped morale, and we needed to ensure that the new DIT export and investment priorities were delivered across the world in a way which maintained the one HMG platform in our posts abroad. The key culture issue, I think, for DIT was learning. We met with trade experts around the world to discuss how best to manage modern trade negotiations. We organised seminars for ministers and officials in London, in Oxford. We expanded our mission in Geneva to help us build expertise in the workings of the World Trade Organization. and we set up the Trade Academy with the FCO to provide state-of-the-art training for subject experts and negotiators across government. We also listened to the needs of startups and innovative firms. A modern trade agenda has to focus on data sharing, cyber security, and digital service provision, as much, if not more, than on traditional tariffs, quotas, and rules of origin. Unsurprisingly, trade negotiations themselves are much like other negotiations. You need to know what you are talking about, understand where the other side is coming from, stay close to ministers who will ultimately have to decide on the deal, and work as a team. About 2/3 of a trade negotiation relies on detailed technical input from across government. So we set up a senior roadshow, which I led, to connect with other Whitehall departments and agencies on what their contribution to trade talks would be, and to check their awareness of the specific issues that would be raised. Trade policy is a new challenge for Whitehall and will require additional resourcing over time. Being clear on whether we are discussing beef with or without bones in it, whether we think bicycles should be defined as an environmental good or not, or understanding why a major trading partner might have concerns about potential goldfish exports, can be key parts of any negotiation. We therefore began organising cross-Whitehall negotiation exercises to ensure we could get this right in advance of formal talks. A high-performing organisation needs diversity and supportive team working. So we organised unconscious bias training, starting with me and our top team, set up diversity networks, had role models including Inga Beale, Chief Executive of Lloyd's Insurance, who spoke at our first leadership conference in the autumn, and we ensured that our promotion systems were transparent and fair. Given the particular challenges of the last year, we also organised an informal discussion of how our managers' work might have been affected by the referendum, hosted by Westminster Abbey Institute, and with the wise input of historian Peter Hennessy. This helped us recognise the personal as well as the professional challenges colleagues can face, and where support is helpful. There is, of course, a lot more for my excellent successor in DIT to do, but it is a tribute to the commitment and enthusiasm of civil servants that an entirely new department was up and running so rapidly and able to deliver for ministers even as the structures rose around us. It's also a vindication of our values. I never heard any questioning of officials' personal views or lack of them on trade or Brexit policy. Ministers have been appreciative of the support they receive and rightly expect high-quality professional advice and then wholehearted delivery of their decisions, which they get. Officials appreciate the trust which they are shown by experienced ministers, the value added by their political advisors, and want to work as an effective team. Our non-exec directors bring insights and experience from outside government and internationally. So stepping back from the DIT experience, what lessons do I draw for the next stage of civil service reform? Let me suggest 3 goals for Whitehall 2022, as I say, building on the good work that's already taking place. First, a sustainably diverse civil service leadership. Specifically, a commitment that within 5 years, half of the senior civil service at all its levels will be women, in line with society and the overall gender balance of the service. It is a perfectly achievable target in every department if we change how we do things. Achieving it will mean a culture shift, which is good for all forms of diversity, including for minority groups, for supportive team working, and for sustaining our personal values. But it will not happen by itself, and it will not happen if we focus only on the top positions to the exclusion of talent pipelines. So how do we do that? Well, every area of leadership needs metrics to show its gender diversity profile and its salary profile. These need to be monitored regularly and form a central part of the appraisal process for each manager. What have they done to deliver a more diverse and effective team? We must ensure that coaching, mentoring and actively supporting women in mid-career is not a nice to have, but is provided to all women and to men too. Career breaks, for whatever reason, should be accepted as a natural part of a successful career and managed accordingly by departments, and part-time working and job shares understood to be as normal as full-time working. With supportive leadership, I have seen director-level job shares successfully manage the toughest policy and parliamentary issues. Senior private secretaries for small children deliver an outstanding service to ministers without working impractical hours. And top teams supporting each other by flexible sharing of responsibilities when unexpected crises at home or in the office threaten one individual's work-life balance. And ministers have been entirely supportive of these ways of working. Better metrics, how are we doing team by team, needs supplementing by greater awareness of our inherent unconscious biases. The evidence here is clear. We can overcome bias through training and organisational change, and the civil service has an opportunity to become a genuine leader in building a highly effective, gender-neutral and diverse modern organisation. But we have to commit to this outcome and become intolerant of all organisational behaviours which are inconsistent with it. If not now, when? Second, responsibility for outcomes and power to make changes need to be very closely aligned. The centre of government has to work in support of the sharp end of public policy delivery. And I say this as a veteran of 5 years in the Cabinet Office and several decades in the Treasury. Departments and agencies managing delivery do not see the solution to more effective government as necessarily involving another centrally driven initiative, combined with several more requests for information from those actually doing the work. One approach would be to effectively abolish departments altogether as separate entities. And when I worked in the centre, I was tempted to go down this road. But I believe that we need separate departments because they do different things. The culture and training required in the Home Office has to be different from, though overlap with, that of the business department, because regulating immigration is not the same as sponsoring innovative research or encouraging business-led apprenticeships. The skills required to run prisons are not identical to those required to lead the student loan company. Negotiating a climate change deal is different from approving infrastructure spending or devising tax breaks for entrepreneurs. Separate departments are not a nuisance, but an invaluable delivery mechanism. Moreover, it's in departments, not the centre, that the value for money buck stops. As accounting officers, permanent secretaries understand all too well the consequences of public funds not being used effectively or efficiently, and rightly have to justify what happens to their ministers publicly to Parliament, and sometimes uncomfortably before the Public Accounts Committee. That responsibility covers the running of the department as well as the value for money of the policies being delivered. For example, given the importance of reliable IT systems today, we've learned that it's not sustainable for the centre to decide unilaterally what should be bought and who should deliver it, when the consequences of getting it wrong fall on individual departments and accounting officers, unless we wish to change the structures of parliamentary accountability which have been used for the last 150 years. Equally, there is scope for more economies of scale through effective shared services, joint professions and so on, coordinated through the centre to ensure that departments do not work as isolated systems and to provide career paths for professional disciplines from accountants to project managers. My view is for these central functions to add most value, they're best controlled collectively. For example, by using senior officials from the major delivery departments as non-executive directors of central IT, HR, finance and estates functions to ensure that they do deliver effectively for the departments using their services. More structured secondment of experienced staff from departments to the centre, both Cabinet Office and Treasury, is important to ensure that the right balance of challenge and support is maintained. Fresh minds need to be complemented by an understanding of why things currently happen as they do, which departmental experience provides. A further advantage of having a number of departments is to use them as laboratories of best practice, as BIS aim to be on delivering diversity. The Centre can facilitate exchanges of best practice between departments without having to control them, and can act as a collective memory, for example, on effective preparation for elections, where there are a range of approaches to learn from. To drive improvement, rigorous civil service training must be a priority. We need to combine the best of the current training modules with a wider commitment to internal learning for all staff, provided by more senior colleagues able to draw on case studies of current issues and discuss the actual decision-making process in confidence with other officials. And we can do more to reach out for training to the university and research communities to improve policy making and facilitate innovation in public services. My final point is the continued relevance of our values, not least during an election period. Professional civil servants have a clear job to do within the democratic process of this country. We have to be seen by ministers, by Parliament and by the public as reliable, honest and competent. The criteria for being trusted, and trusted to be frank. If the price of being accepted into inner councils is to compromise our honest advice, then the price is too high and we must not pay it. If, while genuinely seeking to deliver ministerial priorities, we fear to tell it like it is because we are afraid that our analysis or advice will be criticised, then we are failing in that trust. I believe that we will continue to deliver honesty and competence with the flexibility needed to meet shifting democratic objectives, including the setting up of new departments when needed. And my own experience is that ministers want us to do so. Appreciate the service they receive, even when things occasionally go off track, and are prepared to give us that trust. So I leave Whitehall convinced that the values underlying our professional civil service still work for all of us. They are important. We should keep them in good repair. Thank you.
Excellent. We'll kick off with a few questions from me, just going through a few items in the speech, and then I'll throw it open to the floor and hopefully we can get a bit of discussion going around the proposals and the excellent thoughts that Martin's provided us with. I just want to start on something that's very dear to the heart at the Institute, machinery of government changes, to use the lingo, but actually big organisational changes which often come around the appointment of ministers, reshuffles, new governments. You talked a lot about setting up DIT and the overheads there and the overheads of a new ministry. Do you think people really have, and in particular within the civil service and indeed on the political side, enough appreciation of what it really means, not just in the immediate physical, can we find an office, but actually you talked a bit about your experience at BIS 18 months down the line. There's still two different cultures there, and the real investment that has to go into getting functioning organisations going.
I think that's a bit of a rhetorical question on one level, but it's an important issue. One of the reasons that BIS was still felt quite separate was that up until the 2010 election, there had been a reasonable assumption it might well have been split again. So there's always a bit of a trade-off between remaining flexible and committing to a new culture. But I would say overall, we put too much weight on tinkering with the nuts and bolts of structures and not enough on building those cultures. And that's why I emphasised the importance of a culture of cooperation. We could have had a wonderful organogram and it could have been approved by, a whole series of organisational experts. But if people don't want to play, they don't want to commit, they don't want to do things differently, it's not going to work. So I would say, think about the culture and then build the structures out of and around that, respecting the past and where people have been coming from. If you try and impose a completely abstract structure on people who are already doing very challenging jobs, it's not going to take, or it certainly won't take easily or quickly. And I think it's right, we should think before setting up new departments or making machinery of government changes, but that doesn't mean that they aren't justified or that they don't fulfill an important political or policy role. And I think as civil servants, one of our jobs is to be ready for them. It's not about the quiet life, but it is about having that shared constructive approach to change when it comes.
Excellent, thank you. And you talked a lot about the department is there, and indeed the civil service in Whitehall is there to achieve the outcomes that we need and that the government wants to achieve. Just thinking about as it stands at the moment, you've kind of got quite big challenges coming up. So I think, for example, we're looking to take the 50 or so trade agreements that the EU has and port them over so that we will have our own independent agreements by the time we leave the EU. And I think there's some, if you look at some of the statistics on the department, on pay and benefits, for example, I think the Department for International Trade came bottom. Admittedly, it's a low score, but everyone else is pretty low as well on satisfaction with pay and benefits. Have you got the right people at the moment, and it's a matter of actually, we just need to keep, retain, develop, build a culture around these people, or recruiting and bringing in new people, and we've got the mechanisms there to do that. What are the kind of challenges that sort of kept you awake on that sort of people side, looking over the next sort of 2 years with those huge challenges that are going to be so vital for the country?
The biggest challenge on the trade policy front in the first 9 months was finding that so-called Goldilocks spot between not recruiting hordes of people who didn't have enough to do and not having enough people to do what really needed to be done. And I think we got it broadly right. There was a lot of interest and enthusiasm from across government for people to come and work in the department, a lot of interest from outside as well, varying from very helpful input to some people whose interest was a bit more speculative, and we had to go through the right processes. I think the key was to make sure the people we were recruiting had the capacity to do the job and work flexibly as part of the team. We also had to draw on expertise, but that was a bit separate from bringing expertise into your organisation full time, and there's a different balance there. Because people saw this as a very clear challenge and a good sense of teamwork between what ministers wanted us to deliver and the challenges that we faced and the time we had to do it, we were getting good people applying. Obviously, over time, the old mantra of you've got to recruit, retain and motivate your key people will apply to DIT just as across Whitehall, and that raises wider issues.
Okay. I think we might come back to that later, but just going on to just cover a couple more items. You touched on diversity, and you made a very clear statement, 50% gender at the SCS. And I'm sure others will want to come back on some of those issues. I was just wondering, at the PermSec level, when we've been following the stats on this, that's the level actually that hasn't really moved over the last decade. Everything else is going in the right direction, but no, not quite at the 50%, so not at the 50% mark now. Do you think this should apply, there should be a target at that very top level? You said in the speech that you thought we were a little obsessed with the top, and we should think about pipelines as well, which I've got to agree with. But just, is there a PermSec target as well to be thought about here?
I think we've had a couple of very welcome women PermSec appointments in the last recent time. It's important to focus on the whole of the senior civil service because this has got to be sustainable over time. And that's why I think the argument is about the culture change across every part of Whitehall, so that this isn't a nice to have, it's just a necessary part of a modern, effective organisation which is also open to different forms of experience, to black and minority ethnic leadership, that we've got a range of role models that work. And I think, of course you have to look at the top, but I think my argument is don't simply or too exclusively focus on the top, because it's got to work through the system. People have got to want to take promotion in our organisations, and they don't always at the moment.
Okay, excellent. And then you talked about, and this was where I'm just a little bit, I can't remember the exact phrase, but there was a phrase in the in the speech about, you know, the responsibilities in the centre versus the outside. I was just wondering, with the current reform programmes that are going on across government, just which bits are fall into your box of the things we probably might have overreached on and we haven't actually got to? Which bits sort of fall into the box of actually these are fine, this is useful? So, for example, the commercial profession at the moment, they're running an assessment centre for commercial staff around Whitehall, you know, trying to bring some standards into the quality of people, and some people failing that and some people being helped to try and get through it again. Do you think that sort of activity falls on the good side or the not particularly helpful side of the debate?
That was one of the areas that I mentioned as good examples of how we do clearly add value. I don't think it's two boxes. I think it's an issue of the wider culture. And I've heard chief executives of very large, complex organisations make the same point. You know, the centre is there to help the people at the sharp end do their jobs better. On one level, that's a truism. On another level, making it feel like that is actually quite challenging. And I think we're getting better at communicating that, but it also needs a culture of parity of esteem, if you like, not just into departments, but right out into agencies, who can frequently feel that something's come out of the centre, possibly for entirely justifiable reasons, but makes their life much more difficult, and they don't see what's in it for them when they're trying to deliver a service with a restricted budget and all of the constraints that we rightly apply. So I think we've got to be very aware. It's not just the centre and departments, it's the centre and the whole range of agencies who all have their own purpose and culture and have got to feel they're getting something out of this as well. And very often, for example, in shared services, must be right to do more shared services, but it's also difficult. If you get it wrong, then you don't get any benefit. So I think we've learnt from that, and that's important too.
Yeah, I suppose in that, and I agree with everything you've sort of said there actually, but the question, what sort of out, as it were, would something like Verify, for example, be something that you feel has not really, you know, actually being a helpful experience for Whitehall?
It's important to be evidence-based, and I don't have all the evidence for various initiatives. In my time in the Cabinet Office, which was safely some years ago, I can say that there were initiatives that had seemed a good idea at the time that never quite got fully put to bed. So they'd sort of rust in the rain a little bit. And I think we've got to be very rigorous about saying, okay, we've learnt from this bit worked, this bit didn't, it doesn't need to carry on. We don't have to relaunch it in 6 months' time, but we do have to manage a sense of continuity, because the learning curve for people, even with very sensible change, is considerable. And, for example, dealing with parts of the business sector, we found that it could take up to 2 years for a new government initiative to actually percolate down to all the people who could benefit from it. So it was important you did not change it within those 2 years, because otherwise you risk the cycle continuing. And that's also true organisationally inside government, of course.
Excellent. I think I did get an answer to my question there, but anyway, I'll leave others to interpret what you said. The final question from me. You talked a bit about the need to get the functions leadership responsive to departments, and I think there are quite a few of the people, we interact with them quite a bit, and there's quite an effort going on there, and I think a recognition that those functions really only exist to serve the wider department and their objectives. The question that's come up again and again in our research has been the sort of commitment of Whitehall as a whole to actually working to develop the functions, to develop its skills and things like finance, commercial and things like that. And there was a review a few years ago on the finance function, the financial management review, where the Treasury actually made what I thought was a very sensible decision to bring in a professionally qualified head of public spending, combine the head of public spending role with the head of the finance profession. I think the Chancellor has just agreed to the Treasury actually reversing that change. Without a consultation, without a movement. It sort of opens the question as to whether, is there a seriousness behind these sort of agendas? Are they just the latest sort of thing that we're going to talk about? And actually what we're talking about here is, actually it was all working fine before. Let's go back to the accounting officer, the independent department, permanent secretary in control. And, yes, there's a few little things around the edges that we can do, but actually the old system used to work really well. Is that where we're heading now?
I don't see it as an either or, and it's important not to have the accounting officer system as an afterthought, because as I tried to make clear, it all comes down to that. Ultimately, who's responsible for spending the taxpayers' money? It is ministers and permanent secretaries approving that spending or asking for a direction if they don't think it meets the value for money criteria. That is not a sort of decorative part of the Constitution, and systems which don't take that seriously aren't going to work. But I think on the other point, I just say again, it comes down to culture. The culture of public spending control requires rather different skills from the culture of financial management. Both are very important. You can do them together, you can do them separately. There are challenges both ways. They both have to be done. What is true, I think, is that having built a more cohesive finance function, we've been able to build better career structures, and we've professionalised it. And I was struck in BIS, we had an exceptional, several actually, exceptional heads of finance, and they ran this across all the agencies as well. Yes. So we had a very diverse finance function where you could do jobs in an agency as well as in a department, as well as in the centre, and it's got to be seen in those terms. But financial control, financial management issues are not the same as public spending control, though you hope they overlap.
Excellent, thank you, Martin. Right, I shall throw that open to questions and comments. I'd start and work my way back, so gentleman here we'll start with.
Thank you, Martin, for a very fascinating insight into your 45 years or so in the civil service. I'm Dougal Goodman from the Foundation for Science and Technology. One word that I haven't heard you mention at all is risk, and the whole question of how you inculcate into the culture a risk management philosophy, and also between departments which may have a very different view of risk. Would you like to comment?
I'll take a few questions together. So when on risk there, actually you go down the row to Simon and then to the lady behind.
Simon Judge, Government Finance Function. Martin, one of the interesting aspects of departmental culture is whether departments have a view on particular subjects, a departmental policy on something, and you can think of lots of examples of that. How did that play out in DIT? Were you trying to have a departmental policy, or were you trying not to on anything?
And just the lady just behind there.
Thank you. I really agree with your point about separate departments.
Could you just say who you are?
Sorry. Angela Francis, Green Alliance. Really interested in your point about separate departments, and interested in your reflections on how that affects policy coherence, particularly across the Foreign Office, Department of Trade and BEIS. And I'm reflecting particularly on my own experience. So I was a Foreign Office staffer, climate change attaché and prosperity officer in the Caribbean a couple of years ago. And reflecting on the recent, was it 722 from Putney leak around moving staff from climate change diplomacy to trade caused lots of ructions and upset amongst people in the environmental sector. I was quite sanguine about it because I think actually that's a pretty good direction of travel for our climate change activity, but only if it is true that what's happening on the Foreign Office is linking into industrial strategy. I'd be really interested in your reflections on what's happening and how those three departments are working together on particularly low carbon markets and climate change.
Great. Martin, do you want to take some of all those?
I'm going to stand up for this. Those are really serious questions. The issue of risk, honestly, it does concern me because as a senior official in a department, you have to say to your teams, we expect you to take some risks and manage them carefully, but you can't afford not to, because that implies a bigger risk somewhere else. We don't have the resources and so on. We have to take some risks. We don't know what's going to happen, and our job as senior managers is to protect you. I have to say that, and this is a personal reflection now, dealing with the wider world, and perhaps occasionally with Parliament, on risks that go wrong is a challenge, because people don't tend to easily accept, and it's understandable that you did everything right, it just so happens on this occasion the risk didn't work, or part of it didn't work. And I think we've got to have a much more honest conversation about management of risk. I think it's difficult, it's very difficult for ministers, and I have a lot of sympathy for them, because at the end, if it doesn't work, it hasn't worked, and they're the ones who are out there taking the blame. But if we don't accept that we're always managing risks of different sorts, short-term and long-term, and if we don't try and be professional and as dispassionate about it as we can, then we're not delivering the best available service. So I think we've got more work to do here. On the departmental view, Simon, I remember somebody saying at the last election, what's the biz departmental view on X? And of course we replied, we don't have a departmental view. Let's wait till we see where our ministers are. Now, obviously, people who've worked in areas think this is going to work more smoothly than that. But I don't think that counts as a departmental view. And it seems to me you shouldn't have a departmental view. You should have a lot of evidence, and you should be prepared to offer advice on what's going to work best, highlighting the risks that are going to be taken, particularly the risks over time. And I think one of our real challenges is you may be able to do this in 3 years, it becomes very risky in 2 years. If you try and do it in 1 year, you are actually going to have very serious negative repercussions. And I think sometimes we've got to get more assertive in giving our best available advice on that. Of course, it may be wrong, but you have to try. So departmental view in DIT is a reflection of what our ministers and the Prime Minister want the department to do. Of course it is. I think it's also fair to say that we think trade is a good thing. And I'm pretty relaxed about that, unless and until we got a government that didn't think that. But, that's probably beyond the normal parameters of work, and there are some normal parameters. But I think it's important to be aware of where bits of your department might just be building up an unconscious view of this is how we do things here. And that's another reason why you need to move people around relatively often, not too often, but, between 3 and 5 years, I think is about right. Because otherwise there is a risk that people just start to think, well, I know what the answer is, and the answer is X, it's not B. And that can cause you problems. Policy coherence across departments, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is for me an issue that it's easier inside a department to resolve some conflicts than it is outside. And you could argue that energy and climate change did that. When I was in the Foreign Office a few years ago, we combined the energy and climate teams. It was more powerful and unified when we did that. Equally, I think you need separate departments for the reasons I've gone through. So then you do need to make sure, I think, that the analysis is shared. It's really important that even if we have some disagreements, and a lot of government is about managing disagreements which are entirely legitimate, we're all starting from the same evidence base, and we've tested out potential ways forward with each other. We don't have to agree on them, but we should never be in a situation where we're not starting from a transparently shared empirical view of what's going on and what the options are.
Excellent. I'll start here, then come down there. Thank you.
Miranda Curtis. I'm a trustee at the Institute for Government and also the lead non-executive director at the Foreign Office. My question is about the core remit of DIT. And you've spoken very cogently about the work that's taken place to start to develop new trade policies and the processes for embarking on what is clearly going to be a very complex set of trade negotiations. Given the crucial importance of that work for the future of course, the British economy as well as the British business community, how well do you think DIT specifically and government more generally is doing in reflecting the needs and interests of British business who need to be making very important decisions in the short, mid and long term about recruitment, about investment and about capital allocation?
That's great, thank you. And then the gentleman just there.
James Fraser. Since we're on camera, I won't say which bit of central government I work in, but and you'll explain that in a moment. I was very pleased to hear your comments about diversity and building that in from the start of your recruitment campaign for building the new department, and what you said about role modelling subsequently. It reminded me of some years ago when our permanent secretary and senior management had a sort of open staff forum, and as a white, middle-aged, private school and Oxbridge educated straight male, I stood up and said, I'm glad I've joined this department. I can see it's a place where people like me can get on. But My point was, where are the role models for everyone else? Given that you've had a career at the top of the civil service and the top of departments, one might argue that you have benefited from that traditional bias. Do you feel like you've given enough back for the next generation? And if there's one initiative where you feel you've had an impact on that, what would it be?
Okay, thank you. And then, gentleman just there in front.
Nick Gowing. I'm at King's College as a visiting professor, and also doing a big project about thinking the unthinkable. Martin, you and I have talked about this in the past at the Hay Festival, but before the 23rd of June. But now you are no longer in government. How much do you think the Civil Service Code is under challenge at the moment, being upheld? Because your third point reflects very much what we heard from Ivan Rogers on the 3rd of January, when he said he was leaving, urging people to be more honest, and I could read it back to you, but you know what he said. But this sense of actually those at the top, and certainly ministers, don't really want to hear a lot of what needs to be put before them. And I got a sense, both explicitly and implicitly from your third point, that you're more or less saying this is actually becoming a growing problem. And when you look at the Civil Service Code, I'd put to you that actually that's now under stress from the political imperative, particularly now, with the kind of things that are happening with Brexit.
So, Martin, over to you. Is this the Civil Service Code,
yes.
personal contribution?
So the core remit, I think it's early days. We have made a good start. A lot of this comes down to a partnership with business, and that's easy to say, but actually it's a big challenge for government and for business. I'm struck by the journey a lot of, for example, trade associations have to make into the detail. If you say to them, we will, in 2 years, less than 2 years now, let us assume, be in charge of our own tariff lines. Which tariff lines actually affect your business's bottom lines? And what would you like us to do to them? That's not, on the whole, areas people have gone into. And they need to. Just departments will need to be very aware of, and I touched on this, in any trade negotiation, it isn't a matter, mostly, if you like, for DIT or Foreign Office posts, it's actually about individual subjects. And it's going to be about granular issues in individual subjects, from public procurement through to intellectual property, through to the various high-tech and movement of people issues. We all know these will all come up in trade negotiations. People have to be ready for very granular negotiations. So I think it's something where the business community and government have to talk very intensively on a different level. And I think that's the challenge for the next 12 months, to make sure that we understand in detail what makes a difference on trade, what precisely rules of origin changes would or wouldn't affect a supply chain, and that the people in sectors, and then by extension in any negotiation, really understand that. I think we've started, there's a lot more to do. James, yes, I've been one of the lucky ones, and I think on diversity, I've learnt a lot as a senior manager about how important it is in delivering. It's, of course, an issue of fairness. It's also an issue of excellence. And I don't claim the credit for this, but collectively, for several years in the business department, we had a mixed senior team with a range of role models who were all different. And that was key. And it's very important, we know from evidence, to have a range of role models. And you mentioned the point yourself. I read recently about one of our older universities, which is commissioning a whole set of portraits of women and minority professors to put up on the walls, because there is evidence that if people don't see themselves on the walls, they do worse in exams. And this is very clear empirical evidence. So, we've got to get with the plot here. And I think one thing I can do, I hope, is be helpful in continuing to take this work forward from outside government, because there's a lot to do. Thinking the unthinkable, I want to put it in my own words. We do need to be vigilant. I did say clearly, and I will repeat it, that in the setting up of the Department for International Trade, at no point did I feel anything other than that the professionalism that we were expected rightly to deliver was the requirement, and there was no hidden agenda whatsoever. I would say that in other departments I have worked in as well. I can think of one area where I was concerned that a policy, a democratically chosen policy following an election, might cause some civil servants difficulty to work on. So I simply took them aside and asked them in advance, if we end up doing this, if you don't want to do it, tell me now, we'll move you, it won't be a problem. And you'll do other things, and that's fine. And they thought about it and said, no, we'll stay, and they all did an excellent professional job. But I thought it had been worth just putting the point. So my personal experience is that this system works. What I do think we need to do, though, is be more explicit about justifying it, because we must not lose it in a fit of absent-mindedness. It's not about a sort of putting civil servants on a pedestal. It's about what we deliver, and professionally deliver for government and for the wider country. It is cheaper to have a whole set of people who will just agree with what you want. That's another model. It's not good value. And I think it is important that if we believe, as I do, that this model is what delivers, then we've got to go on saying so loudly, giving evidence, and also celebrating its success. And I would offer setting up the Department of International Trade as a good example of its success, which is to the credit of our ministers, as well as, if not more so, than the rest of us.
Excellent. Thank you, Martin. Just the gentleman just there first, and then the lady behind, then come to the front.
Robert Morland. I'm a former member of the European Parliament, so you'll not be surprised when I say I rather support what the last questioner asked, and I'm fairly cynical on whether or not the change is going to benefit us. But what I noticed you didn't touch on was whether you're going to sectionalise, or the view is to sectionalise the department at all. I mean, very striking to me that EU trade is 47, or whatever it is, % of our trade, and therefore it has to be vastly more central, certainly over the coming years, particularly because we don't actually know what the final situation is going to be on the internal market. And a lot, even after that, of negotiations elsewhere will have to kind of relate to that. And I'm wondering what you're doing to meet that objective.
Thank you. There's the ladies immediately behind. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Mary Dejevsky, I write for The Independent and The Guardian. Given that there is this shortage of people with the sort of expertise that you have, why aren't you and other people in similar positions being either press-ganged or induced to stay on in some capacity in the national interest? Thank you.
Excellent. And then just at the front, Jill. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jill Rushton from the Institute for Government, overseeing our Brexit work, and we've got a forthcoming paper which Oliver Eilert, who's tweeting over there, is preparing for launch next month on how do you build trade policy capacity in government. As a sneak preview, one of our points is that actually the very typical civil service model, which Martin, you're clearly a very convinced defender of, for things like, say, moving people every 3 to 5 years, is actually really inimical to building the sort of expertise that you need for trade agreements. Talk to the Canadian High Commissioner. She says CETA took 5 years to negotiate. We already know that's a weakness when we negotiate in Europe, that the German has been there for the entire length of every working group that's ever met. The Brit is there for a year and then moves on. I just wondered what thought you were giving to building a sort of specialist trade cadre of people to do that negotiating role, as opposed to the sort of more generalised skills that you need in the trade department, and how you saw that developing.
Excellent. Martin.
Thank you. I think on how the department relates to the trade challenges of the EU as an external body and then third countries is getting a little close to policy for me to comment on usefully, but it does raise the issue of how the department for exiting the EU links in with the Department of Trade. And obviously, we're not going to do things twice because we don't have the resources and it wouldn't be sensible. What I'd say is, in the early months, we were very clear that we would need to work together. Over time, the Department for Exiting the EU may not be a permanent department, one would assume, and you'd want to think about how you manage this. I think it does honestly come down, though, to this culture of cooperation. So whether you've got DexEU officials in charge of part of this as opposed to a third negotiation is ultimately for ministers to decide. The key thing is that we're providing a seamless technical service that gets the right information and detail and trade-offs in place. I don't know about the press gang point. It's, I had thought of leaving the civil service slightly earlier, in fact, but I stayed on to help set up this department. I think that's an issue for ministers, really. It's going to be a very complex and probably labour-intensive process. And those of us who have worked in or with or both in Brussels know well that these things seldom go smoothly or quickly. So I think that is going to be a challenge for the new government. Do you know, on trade deals, I don't think I was suggesting people should move around every year. I was saying that in areas of expertise, it's important that you don't let it fossilise a bit. Clearly, if you've got a trade negotiation going on and it's lasting for 4 or 5 years, you're going to want to keep a degree of continuity. If it's lasting for 10 years, well, you know, there are arguments about how you do that. You've got to maintain the collective memory. You do need to build expertise, and we do need to build a negotiation cadre, and they will have some specific training, and we're certainly doing that. Equally, I was struck by one seasoned senior negotiator in a friendly Commonwealth country, I won't go further than that, who said, you have to move them every so often to keep them sane. You can't have people doing trade negotiations for years and years. And there's something in that as well, I think, given that, you know, it's going to be a bit of a grind. So I think it is an issue of balance. I don't want to sound too Panglossian, but I think one advantage that we will have is we're building a 21st century trade capability. So these issues about, you know, how does a tech scale up work, the global trading system, are ones that we can take from zero. We're not starting from, this was how it worked in the 1980s and 90s, and then all those years doing Doha. And we've got to make sure that we benefit from that by focusing on how the economy is today, not the bits of the economy that might actually make the most noise, but aren't the most important. I just want to come back briefly to this issue of values and professionalism. I think it is part of a wider challenge that, as you know, Honora O'Neill has written very lucidly on, of how do you gain trust in a world where actually there's less of it about. And I think that is a real challenge for professional civil servants, with all of our manifest imperfections and internal inadequacies. We need to be better at explaining what we do and why it works and why it delivers a better outcome for ministers, for Parliament, for the wider public than other solutions which might rely less on empirical expertise and more on highly political focus. Because these arguments cannot be taken for granted. I think they are still there, but we do need, as I said, to be vigilant about them.
Martin, I just wanted to come back on one thing you were talking about there, this churn issue. I mean, it's the thing that comes out again and again in our research. You hear it from ministers all the time in our sort of effectively exit interviews on Our Ministers Reflect. I ended up being the expert. The officials, the permanent civil service had turned over. You get it yourself. I mean, I met in the last 4 weeks, I can probably name about 5 officials who have been in post for a relatively short time, who seem to be central to an initiative but are moving on. And And for the trade stuff, the trade negotiators, I can see the sort of, this deep specialism, and you might need to move them around a bit. But inside the departments, and lots of departments across Whitehall, they're going to need a load of interlocutors who really know what they're doing and how they're going to manage those negotiations and what the policy situation is and the relationships. Is there a way the civil service can overcome this? Because there doesn't seem to me to be a political driver to say you must move people as regularly as possible and really frustrate ministers as much as you can by this. Why do we keep doing it? And is there a solution in anything you're talking about to this?
That sounds slightly like a sort of, are you going to stop hitting your wife immediately or over time question.
It's a question I've asked to a lot of former permanent secretaries and never had an answer to.
I don't quite recognise it. I mean, clearly people move because they change their jobs, they leave, they take career breaks, and I understand ministers' frustrations, and as a senior official you feel it as well. All I'm saying is that you want to make sure that you haven't left somebody in a rather key role for 10 years and nobody else understands what's going on, because that is not good for ministers or the rest of the department, nor usually for management. It is a balance. I know it's a rather boring thing to say, but it is a balance. At senior official level, you try not to move your director and your deputy director and your DG at the same time, and occasionally it happens, and sometimes it happens because the centre intervenes, and that's life. Or you're doing it because some other area needs something more. I think it is important, and I'd say specifically in areas like spending teams, that the Treasury have deep expertise in the departments that they are working with, and that the finance teams in departments have expertise, so you have a seriously professional discussion. I think, though, specifically on trade, this business of expertise is very, very important, and I did mention it because 2/3 of the work will be done by the experts. The trade negotiators are not a sort of cadre of people who come along with their crew cuts and bash the table. It isn't like that. A lot of the work will be done in detailed areas. What's the IP approach to audiovisual going to be, as opposed to, what are our phytosanitary standards and how far will mutual recognition go in GMO areas? And, it's those sorts of issues. And the challenge for Whitehall will be many more of the subject experts, a deputy director and below, are going to have to be able to deal with trade issues. So the Trade Academy is consciously working on two levels. One is you've got to train up the negotiators, and there'll be people from departments who come and be the overall agriculture or environment person in a team. But they are going to have to work with a whole set of people who must understand enough about how a trade negotiation works to be able to work with them. So they need a different sort of training. Yeah. And that's the plan. And I think you have to train a lot of people, and we're going to have to mainstream it for many more policy jobs than was the case in the past.
Okay, thank you. Vicky, I just had a hand up and then in front, and I'll come back down.
Thank you. Vicky Price from CBR and a former civil servant. You talked about trust in terms of the public trusting and the politicians trusting civil servants. But of course it's going to be a very tough time, because although there's going to be a lot of effort on Brexit, as we've just been hearing, there are all the other things going on which are not going very well. So whether it's National Health Service, social care, education, transport possibly, criminal justice system, etc., and also possibly energy. And of course, that will all be happening over the next few years while the negotiations are going on, with constraints on budgets and so on. So the civil service will be constantly fighting to survive or do good policy and justify that good policy somehow to the public, to the select committees, to their own ministers in a way. And things, as we've seen, go very wrong. HMRC's computer system for VAT payments for things that are coming in and out, and et cetera, et cetera. There's loads of things that we hear about every day. So what will this do to the civil service morale over the next few years? And are you, in fact, yes, trade is now quite a sexy area. Everyone wants to go in for it. Are you going to hemorrhage everywhere else?
Okay, thank you. And gentleman just in front there, and then gentleman there, I'll come.
Thank you. Peter Hennessy. Martin, can I follow up Nick Gowing's question? Do you think it's got harder progressively over your 35 years to speak truth under power? And if so, why? And when were the particular moments when we went down the vortex a bit?
Excellent, thank you. And gentleman just over there.
Andrew Smith, when the Canadian Federal Trade Minister was in London a few months ago, she talked about the hundreds of trade negotiators that the country the size of Canada has. Just wondered whether you've nicked any from her, and also how far are you to getting the personnel level that you need?
Martin, over to you. Vortexes, challenges, left, right and centre in the Canadian.
Okay, I think both the resource issue and the issue of confidence and support for officials in tough situations, trying to juggle a whole set of constraints, is going to get more challenging in the time ahead, in all probability. And I think that means that we need not just ministers, but Parliament, and if possible, the wider media, to actually understand and support what civil servants are doing. We also have to look at resource levels, because clearly there comes a point where efficiency takes you so far, but you do run into the risk of a diminution of quality of service simply because you don't have enough capacity. And it's right to test that, but it also does exist, we all know that. And you have to do something about it. Similarly, you have to make sure that the people at the sharp end feel they've got careers with a balance of salary and pension, but also stress levels which they are prepared to take as part of being in public service, rather than deciding that they could actually do other things elsewhere and go and do them. And we mustn't let it get to the stage when too many of them choose to do that before we do something about it. Peter, that's a really mean question. I will, however, try to be honest. I think it has got more difficult, partly for the good reason that when I started in the dim and distant 1980s, Parliament was a lot more clubbable. There was a lot less 24-hour media, and frankly, there was probably a lot more that happened without anybody ever finding out about it. So it's good that those things have changed. I think, though, the constant media pressures on all politicians and the diminution of space to set out a complex argument has cut away at this issue of civil servants are a sort of dull but decent lot doing a professional job. And actually, yes, Minister, in its amusing way, probably didn't help either. I think then the move towards the 24-hour media cycle, the fact that you could make a speech in Parliament, and this was already true, I think, in the 1990s, which would get zero coverage, the fact that, as we know, newspapers stopped covering Parliament, it's getting quite difficult for people to understand the complexity of what's going on. And, I admire anybody who looks up Hansard, but it doesn't happen very often. And the gap between what's being said in Parliament and the sort of caricatures in parts of the media is worryingly wide. I think I'd also have to say that there have been cases in the past, and I have not worked with any of the Secretaries of State that I've worked with, have led to cases where some civil servants were frightened of some political advisors having influence over their careers. It hasn't been generalised. It has, I think, happened, and it's something we have to be very careful of. I think the other factor, which we have seen, and it's neither good nor bad, but it's real, is a progressive centralisation of more decision-making at the centre of government, whether in the Treasury or Number 10 or sometimes a bit in between. That's a reality. That affects how information reaches the decision makers. And I think it's something we have to be very careful of. We're not going to go back to the days of the 1980s. I remember going to Cabinet Office meetings at 3 o'clock and everybody waited for the tea to come round at 4:15 before the conclusions at 5. And that was perhaps slightly too how can one put this, meandering a way of dealing with the issues. But there were papers, there were a lot of people sitting down and working through an issue, and there was often quite a long set of written conclusions. If we're in a world where that level of written material is seen as a risk for leaks, or simply people are too busy to read, or is going to be filtered by someone else, then I think there is a risk that truth does not get as close to power as it needs to. And I think we need to look carefully at that, because it's in no one's interests. And it's also in no one's interests that there are ever any cases of people appearing to suffer for telling people bad news. And again, I'm not saying that happens, but I think we need to be vigilant, because if people get that impression, they will aim off, and then we will all lose out.
Right. I think there was a question on...
Oh, sorry, on Canada, yeah. Well, you know, Canada is a very complex federal state, and that is one reason why they need quite a large system internally to make sure that all the states are happy with what's going on. Now, you could argue that this is also an element of UK policy, but we're not quite at the stage that Canada is. We are working with the Canadians, they won't mind me saying so, with the Australians, New Zealanders, and actually various others to benefit from their, not just their understanding of how you do this, but actually how they train people, who they use. We've got openings into people who have experience of doing this work. I think the key thing to remember, though, is there is no single model. It does not work for us to copy Canada. Or we had a very helpful New Zealander on secondment for a couple of weeks. We can't use the New Zealand model because their interests are different, but we can take from it. And that's what we are doing. That's what we have to do. So maximum of learning, but there isn't a sort of photocopied model which you take over and say, right, now we need 17 more people in these areas.
Okay, thank you. There's a question just down here.
Thanks. I'm Jen Gold, Institute for Government. I had a question about the role functions can play in the leadership teams of departments. If you look at sort of private sector, charity sector, even wider public sector organisations, they tend to have people like roles such as the chief finance officer or HR director on their executive teams. Now, Whitehall is quite patchy in that regard. It actually performs quite well because there is the HR director, finance director are on the executive team. So I wonder if you could talk about the benefits, the value of having those individuals in the top team.
Yeah, I've seen it work in different ways. What matters is that HR and finance also talk seamlessly to each other and are talking to whoever's doing the IT organisation, whoever's doing the infrastructure, whoever's doing the wider shared services work. I'm pretty relaxed. I've seen a model work where we had one chief operating officer, director general, and finance and HR functions underneath. But also, we had an organisation where the directors took a significant part in running the whole setup. So I do honestly think it comes back to culture again. I don't think it should be about, you have one seat for your lawyer and one seat for your finance expert. Equally, you can't have a senior team who aren't thoroughly connected and aware of all these issues. And I'd also say that one of the positive factors of the last 10 years with the professionalisation input of non-executive directors is we take audit committees much more seriously. They become a positive part of governance, and making sure that the head of your audit committee, usually an experienced outside non-exec, is connected in, as your lead non-exec has to be, to the day-to-day workings of the department and also to the informal advice that you need is very important. And finally, you can have junior ministers who have great management experience themselves, and it's very important to tap into that because you want to use all the resources you've got.
Excellent. I think we have 1 second bite at the cherry, and if anyone else wants to catch my attention just before the end, but just the lady there, and then I'll wrap up. Go ahead.
Thank you. Angela Francis, Green Alliance, again. You've mentioned a number of times that when we get into the trade negotiations, it's going to be really detailed, and it's the granular detail that's going to matter, and you need business to come forward and tell you exactly what regulatory standard or tariff is going to be an issue for them. Obviously, those standards and the UK's high standards, particularly on environment, aren't just a business interest, they're also a civil society and consumer interest. Just thinking about the civil services role in not only trying to get business to come forward, and actually it's in their interest and they will be motivated to do that, how are you going to relate to consumers and civil society, because they won't have the facility to do that, and you're going to have to engage them in a different way. So are there plans for how to do that, and what's the civil service's differential responsibility with engaging with the public on standards?
Excellent question. A couple more just to go. Gentleman back there. Greg, did you want to? Greg, did you want to ask a question? Yeah. Let him go and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
Greg Rosen, Greg Rosen, Reform. Just picking up on Lord Hennessy's question about speaking truth under power. If securing the good trade deals to which politicians aspire proves to be a great deal harder than they hope, what will be the process for officials making that clear?
Excellent, thank you for that. And just behind there, yes.
Good evening, Robin Rogers, Oxfordshire County Council. Just actually inspired by the lady from the Green Alliance. You mentioned the regions, and I don't expect a devolution of trade policy to local government, but I wonder what you think about the place-based elements of the industrial strategy and how important it is to think about trade and industry and industrial strategy as it relates to the different places within the country.
Yes, I don't want to overload you, Martin, but I just want to take one more question just down here.
If one looks across the...
Sorry, could you say who you are?
John Hagestad, ex-civil servant. If one looks across at the Brexit industry, one sees the big multinationals can call on the law firms and other expensive consultants. Below that, there is, if you like, medium and small-sized business which needs to be apprised of the various possibilities that are going to confront them on the international trade scene in a few years' time. Is this something the department will get out and do in due course?
Excellent. Martin.
Thank you. On consumers, this is an issue which is very close to the heart of the current Trade Secretary of State. He's made the point that we have absolutely got to get out and connect with and explain to people what the difference of lower tariff and quotas can be to the cost of goods in the shops, but also to wider trading, employment and growth opportunities. I think it is important that we never let ourselves get captured by corporatism, and it's always a risk because, and I'm talking about civil servants now rather than ministers, because the corporate organisations are the ones that have the resources on the whole and can come and talk to you. So, we did try very hard in Biz to get out and meet business angels, startups, smaller businesses, and of course the network around the country that former UKTI had and that we've maintained is very helpful on that. But I think it is important to realise that trade is, and in a sense it's just a delivery mechanism. It delivers a set of policies which ultimately ministers will have to decide on, and I think that's the issue when it comes to how trade policy fits into industrial strategy and fits into place. It's clear if you look at issues like steel, as we've had to very closely in the last 2 years, that this is very important for specific parts of the country as well as having knock-on effects. And I think one of the challenges that we need to ensure we meet, and that I know Bays are very aware of, is providing advice to ministers and more generally about the place implications of all policies, including trade policies, while recognising the wider dynamic effects that you have across the economy as well as in individual places that are adjusting. I think on harder deals, I would see this as just one example of the classic. When you are dealing with ministers who ask for something, it's important to keep them in touch with how it's going. It shouldn't ever come as a surprise. Ministers should never say, "Why wasn't I told?" You should err on the side of over-communicating. And, some trade deals may prove very difficult, some may not happen for some time, some may prove easier than we thought. There's a lot of uncertainty, not least political. So it's very important that you start by setting out the reality, what you hope to achieve, what could be achieved, but also, the range of options and the risks involved and what you're doing to mitigate them. I think the key thing is not just to present it as it's all very difficult, but to actually come back with, well, this is what we think we can do. Do you want us to do this? Do you want us to do more? Recognizing it could be expensive, it might not work, and it might still take time, and so on. But you've got to have that sort of continuing dialogue, and that will be very important in the trade area. I think on SMEs, it is helpful in the Department for International Trade that we've got trade promotion, because it's, if you like, what I call trade practice going with trade policy. So it will be easier both to get intelligence from British companies of all sizes as to what matters most to them, and to make sure they understand the potential advantages. For example, the EU's very successful free trade deal with Korea has benefited a lot of UK companies. And the figures on trade with Korea have, noticeably ticked up, not just with larger firms. That's in part because a big campaign went on, working with our post in Korea, with our trade promotion teams, to make sure businesses found out about this. Online, it's a lot easier to do this, but you do have to target markets. So I think it's an important point to bear in mind, to resource and to check that we're getting right.
Excellent. Martin, thank you. I'm going to draw to a close in a second. There's one or two more questions coming. I've got one from me, actually, just follows up from Greg's question. The process that we follow if we find ourselves in trade negotiations where, perhaps we think actually we haven't got the resource to do all the negotiations that we're getting into. I think feasibility is part of the accounting officer responsibilities now. Would you expect an accounting officer to ask for direction to pursue a set of trade negotiations where there wasn't the capability to actually bring them about? You can pause on that for a second. I think there's one question just down here, and just to wrap it up.
Hi, my name is Teresa Potocka. I was recently... I was recently part of the UK Trade Mission to MIP TV. So I have a question off the back of what you just mentioned about Korea. How does that convert into real numbers? So, of course, it's going to take us a significant amount of time before we actually create... I'm setting up an online TV channel, but before those conversations actually convert into real export figures, let's say that we're exporting our product into another market, then I'm wondering what really you've achieved in that sort of UK Korea through that agreement, and how that translates and converts really, and where the real numbers are coming from. Thank you.
Martin.
Thanks. On that last point, no longer working for government, I can't give you the figures, but I know they are available. So if you want to contact DIT, I'm sure they'd be happy to tell you. I mean, there are clear increases in various sectors. I think automotive is one of them, David. And it is interesting that there has been a clear causal effect of a trade deal. It's a reminder that these things do make a difference. I think on the process and feasibility, I would see it as a serious failure, really, if we even got to the stage of thinking about accounting officer directions. There has to be a continuing dialogue about, we've got this resource, we've got these options, where are we using it? And that I know that dialogue has gone on. I have been part of it. I think it's a very important dialogue because it's about what you're using the resources of the department to do, what you can get from it. But again, it must be a continuing dialogue. And then as the sort of putty sets into clay, you've got X people working on this negotiation and you can't pull out of it halfway through. So, you have to make sure you've thought of the risks and you're making the commitment, and it's for a period of time and you're keeping the people on that. But initially, you can sort of keep a certain number of balls in the air and then see which ones you want to focus on, depending what the options are.
Excellent. I think I heard in that probably at the end of the day, if everything went wrong, what it never would, it probably was part of the accounting officer thing. I'm not sure. But anyway, we'll leave that for now. Martin, Thank you very much for coming here. You have, of course, come here before and spoken at the Institute while actually a permanent secretary, and I think it's one of the things we really appreciate here, the senior leaders of the civil service actually speaking in a public forum about the work that actually goes on in Whitehall, about the issues that you face and the trade-offs, and what it is to lead one of the best civil services in the world, very clear from a lot of the evidence. And thank you very much for taking all those questions tonight, and we wish you all the best in your future pursuits. I heard many times you were not walking away from all of this as you go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.